Hi, everybody. Welcome to our CAHRScast today. We're glad you're joining us. My name is Beth Flynn Ferry. I'm the Executive Director of Cornell Center for Advanced HR Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our 9th CAHRScast of 2021. And we're going to focus on talent management during the post-pandemic transition, which I know is on many people's minds right now. As we emerge from COVID-19 and the pandemic, companies are really eager to define and transition to a post-pandemic normal. But with new hybrid work schedules and models, increasing employee attrition across industries, and continued uncertainty about the lasting impacts of the pandemic period on the employment relationship, all your companies are facing a host of talent challenges. To better understand this and how our partners are thinking about it, CAHRS conducted a series of 4 working groups that focused on issues ranging from improving the candidate experience, to managing employee turnover and worker mobility, to evolving learning and development, and building and maintaining employee engagement. Over the next 90 minutes, what we want to do is share with you the insights that we had from these working groups. And I'm happy to introduce our panelists that are with us today. Each of these Cornell faculty members facilitated one of those groups and are going to share the insights that they gleaned from those. So let me introduce Brad Bell, who is the William J. Conity Professor of Strategic HR in the ILR School, who also serves as my partner in CAHRS as the Academic Director of CAHRS. John Hausknecht is the Professor of HR Studies in the ILR School. Rebecca Kehoe is an Associate Professor of HR Studies in the ILR School, and JR Keller is an Assistant Professor of HR Studies here at the ILR School. We really want today's session to be interactive, and we've built in time for Q&A. So as you have questions, please submit those using the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll address them as we go through the program. I also encourage you to use the chat function throughout today's session to share your thoughts and experiences with others who are on the call to engage in dialogue with those attendees. So with that, let's get started with the panel. I'm going to ask each of you to highlight 2 to 3 key takeaways or insights from the working group that you facilitated. So taking about 5 minutes each. JR, why don't you kick us off with insights from your working session on improving the candidate experience?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. We had a really wonderful working group on this, and I'm happy to be able to share some of the insights back to our broader membership. You know, one of the things that came up was that one of the big results, at least in terms of the world of recruiting, the results of the pandemic has been an increased awareness among companies about the importance of the candidate experience. You know, pre-pandemic, many companies had a clear playbook for how to attract talent and move them through the hiring process. But all that got upended when recruiting went virtual, right? And by having to change the process, it made companies, and by extension candidates, revisit their expectations of what the hiring process should look like. And there were 2 big takeaways that really came through during the course of our discussion. And one is an increased emphasis on continuous communication with candidates, right? Candidates want to know exactly what the hiring process is going to look like, what each of those steps involve, and how long it's going to take to move through the process. So they really want to know the timelines. And among candidates, right, there has been much less tolerance for radio silence and an increased demand and really an expectation for transparency. So they want to know, for example, how many interviews am I going to have to participate in, right, before I know if I got an offer? And if I'm going to have to do 3 interviews, why do I have to do 3 instead of 2? If you're going to ask me to take this particular assessment, why do I need to take it? And why is it so long? And if I'm going to take this assessment, am I going to get the results or some feedback based on that? So candidates are asking a lot more questions of employers, and so that transparency can be really helpful. You know, as I'm sure John is probably going to allude to in sort of the turnover piece, candidates also feel, you know, like as employees do, candidates feel like they have lots of other options. And so they're much less tolerant as they have maybe been in the past for delays. And this idea of sort of ghosting candidates and not letting them know where they stand, or even if their application has been received, is continuously being reflected in negative comments on Glassdoor and other sites. So this idea of continuous communication, expectations, and transparency through the process, I'm calling that one big takeaway, even though I guess it's really several. And the other is a re-emphasis on understanding that onboarding is actually part of the candidate experience, right? This recognition that new hires should really be thought of and treated as candidates for at least their first month on the job, and often up to 3 months, because they're just really starting to understand the organization and the people in the organization. And a small but related point I just want to add is there were a lot of comments in there about recognizing that because things were virtual and you couldn't walk down the hall, that internal hires also needed to be treated as candidates and onboarded into their new roles.
Thanks, JR. Yeah, I'm sure I'm gonna, when we move to John here on sharing insights regarding managing turnover and worker mobility, some of your themes might be repeated. John, what were your insights?
Thanks, Beth, and thanks, JR, for setting this up. I think we had some overlapping content for sure. So I've broken my summary into 3 main buckets here. The first is around just sort of the current context. What are we seeing in companies right now with turnover and mobility? The second is around the causes. So a number of participants talked about the range of reasons why they're seeing this surge in attrition. And then the third category is around interventions, or what companies are doing to try to stem the key losses of talent in this current period. So just some summary points on each of the 3. The first around the current context. It's pretty evident from the Bureau of Labor Statistics data where we are in terms of turnover and attrition. It's the highest since we've begun recording turnover rates through BLS. That said, and it's a theme we heard in the working group, certain industries are more or less affected, right? So if you look at the data broken out by industry and BLS, you'll see hospitality, retail, healthcare, certain sectors with turnover rates that are twice the national average, right? And then there are others that are a little bit more resilient and have been affected a little bit less. So, that was, I think, something that came out of the working group, is that although there's this general rise in attrition, certain sectors and even certain job groups are being affected differentially. I think the other piece of that, just on a sort of a side note, is that with the pandemic, we've had kind of a simultaneous shock to everyone's employment relationship to reconsider their relationship with the employer. And so I think that's something that traditionally happens sporadically, and these events are experienced personally on a more random basis. But I think what we're seeing here is that collectively, everyone is rethinking their current situation and potentially looking for alternatives. So that's a little bit on the context. In terms of causes, maybe we could talk in more detail about some of this later, but intensification of workload, I think, was a key theme amongst companies, especially for HR folks in particular, as one of the key reasons for leaving. A lot of uncertainty and employee mistrust, right? Hearing different things from the organization as far as what's next, as far as what's happening with flexibility or return to office. So some of those issues came up for sure. And I think we have to acknowledge the external labor market is as strong as ever for employees in a lot of domains, or a lot of job categories. And so that's another key driver, I think, here. It's not just what's happening internally, but the availability of alternatives in the external market. That said, too, there's all this pent-up demand that people really weren't moving during the pandemic. And then now that employers are opening up again, you're seeing this rise in attrition. So some of the causes are sort of related and help explain that surge. And the last bucket around interventions, I think it's kind of the classic HR areas, right? So a lot of companies focusing on comp and retention bonuses, pay raises, right? And not on a much quicker timetable is something that I think we heard too, that we're not waiting for the annual review cycle, but more instantaneous and rapid interventions on the comp side. Additional attention to development, right? How are we developing leaders in this new remote work environment so that they're better able to connect with new hires and with existing employees to kind of encourage retention. And then the last piece, just around something that JR mentioned around recruitment messaging, and just really emphasizing what we're saying to candidates, how we're messaging opportunities about the organization and the recruitment process was sort of another key theme here, kind of all geared towards we're losing folks at a high rate. So as we bring folks in, let's see if we can do better with retaining new hires, because that was a higher risk group, is another point we heard in the discussion. So those are some of the key themes, and I'm sure we'll talk more about them as we go.
Thanks, Thanks, John. Turning over to you, Brad, John just did mention, the evolving learning and development area, especially in regards to leadership development. What did you find in your working group on that topic?
Yeah, thanks. I think there was a couple important takeaways from the discussion we had around learning and development. And not surprising, a lot of the discussion was about the shift of learning over the past year and a half, largely to kind of virtual, delivery, which has been the case, across the board. And I think what we heard from companies is that's been somewhat of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it's created new opportunities. For example, we heard about programs being able to be expanded to cover audiences across different geographies, internationally. So bringing people together for learning that, generally might have been more siloed as they went through particular programs. We also heard that kind of executive involvement in learning and development has increased because it's much more easier for executives to log on to a session virtually and participate or share their experiences, as opposed to when they might have had to go on site for an in-person program. One of the interesting kind of opportunities that I didn't expect to hear was talked about it's much easier in the virtual environment to track kind of learners learning journeys. When in normal times, when a lot of this is occurring maybe more through social learning or experiential learning, much more difficult to kind of track exactly what learning employees are doing. Obviously, when it's online, it's, we know exactly what people are doing and the kind of sequence of courses they've taken. And that's allowed companies to dig in and look a bit at, what are those successful learning journeys that employees have been on, to try to replicate them more broadly. At the same time, there's, certainly challenges with the kind of shift to virtual delivery. One is the loss of social interaction. One participant I thought said it well in the sense of, learning and development was one of those last places where you could pretty much guarantee on interacting with others, right? In a kind of a social sense. And now we don't even have that. So what are the implications of that for, networking? I think to some of the earlier comments by John and JR, for onboarding new employees, if we're doing that virtually, what do we lose with that kind of social interaction? Because we know it's not quite the same when we're online or virtual as when we're in person. We also heard about trainers having to adjust because engaging participants in the online environment is very different than what they might have done in the past when they're in the classroom or in other settings. So it's created kind of new challenges for trainers as well to kind of adjust their approach. I think the second key burnout, again, which dovetails with some of the earlier themes, is really around the impact of employee burnout on participation in learning and development. John talked about work intensification. And I think as work is intensified, as employees have experienced burnout, companies are finding it harder to engage employees in things like learning and development, right? Particularly if those are kind of voluntary activities. And so I think it's also been compounded, with this shift to virtual learning, because the prospect for any one of us to, log on to yet another kind of virtual online, discussion, is not maybe where we want to spend our time if given the choice. And I think companies are trying to address this in a few different ways. One is really trying to emphasize bite-sized kind of just-in-time learning, kind of getting away from these really kind of long, extensive programs to how do we make sure that the learning that employees need is available there when they need it and they can consume it as quickly as possible. And maybe that's not a traditional kind of e-learning. Maybe it's just connecting them with a peer that they can, discuss a problem with, so thinking about other, approaches. The second piece is really amping up marketing. I think learning and development at times kind of takes the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come approach. And I think, again, it's not going to work. We really need to be out there making sure employees are aware of the learning, are aware of the benefits of participating in learning, even when they have all these other kind of demands on their time. And the last piece, made somewhat obvious, is really trying to make the content as engaging as possible. So there was a lot of discussion around things like storytelling, learning from peers. So, getting away from maybe the more kind of asynchronous online learning to really create these more engaging learning experiences that draw people in and keep them engaged while going through the programs.
Great. Thanks, Brad. Becca, I'm going to turn to you. Brad was talking about, how to build and maintain engagement in learning and development. What did you find out from companies about overall culture and building and maintaining engagement in this environment?
So yeah, thanks. Several of these themes have also come up. Also came up in my session. One of the things that came up was this perception among organizations that employees are really kind of conveying mixed and sometimes what seems like conflicting sentiments. So there's a sense of isolation and burnout and fatigue, lack of community that has developed over the course of the last 18 months. And it seems like much of this is connected to kind of working at home in this isolated remote work environment. And yet at the same time, organizations are facing widespread resistance to return to the office from employees. And so one of the challenges is negotiating how do we reconcile kind of these concerns that we have among employees and their well-being with how do we think about the best way to move forward, both for the organization, but also to address those well-being concerns. A second, somewhat related point, and this certainly came up, I think John mentioned it as well, leading is different in a remote work environment. Being a manager, a people leader has been a different role in the last 18 months. And one of the things organizations are recognizing is just the importance of acknowledging that managers are burned out too. So managers have been dealing with many of the same challenges and changes that employees have in the last 18 months. But in some cases, that intensification has been even greater for them. They're in positions of trying to absorb some of the uncertainty, trying to communicate the right messaging to their employees, while dealing with the burnout and engagement issues that we're seeing among the workforce. So one of the solutions that a couple of participants in my working group shared was while really focusing on attending to employee engagement, being mindful about being really focused in those efforts. So we're not asking, managers to do 10 new things, maybe focus on one or two things that are going to be most effective while also not overloading the manager. And the third takeaway that I wanted to bring up was a shift that organizations have been trying to explicitly make in the mentality around engagement. So several participants expressed the sentiment that there's a concern that among managers, the engagement score they'd come to view it as kind of their rating of effectiveness as a manager. That's the target, how good is your engagement score? And so there's really been a push to rethinking that, to making sure that the mentality isn't that that's the end in itself. That's the starting point. So we use that as a metric, but then dig into it further through focus groups, interviews, whatever additional data we can get, and then do something about it. So then figure out what are the focused investments we can make to actually improve engagement. The score in and of itself isn't the end. That should just be something to guide our initial efforts. And several organizations kind of emphasize that mentality that they're trying to shift as part of both addressing the issues with employee engagement, but also in attending to managers. So if we can hone in by collecting additional data on what the main issues with engagement are, we can identify the best one or two actions that managers can take versus saying kind of, here's an open-ended approach to how you can fix your employee engagement score.
Great. Thanks, Becca. Good first round of key takeaways. To those that are viewing this, I encourage you to submit some questions through the Q&A as well. We do have one, John, that I'm going to start with you on from Eileen here, who's asking, do you think the current attrition trends will impact the future of which industries or job roles will have the greatest need? And she adds, thinking from the perspective of those going into college and or looking to career changes. Any data there?
Yeah, I think there are the industry level differences in attrition, which probably creates greater vacancies in some areas than others going forward. My sense, and I'm just sort of forecasting here, just based on my own instinct, is that it seems like new entrants into the labor market right now, new college graduates in particular, are rethinking sort of what they want out of their careers. In the past, it was the same issues are still important today, but I think geography played a huge role in the past, and maybe it's less so going forward. is just one example. We see students here who are thinking very broadly about what they want their lives to look like and what role they want work to play in that, and how they want that work to be structured, whether they want to be in a physical office or have more of a hybrid approach. So I think just the nature of the employment relationship is what's shifting, more so probably than what industry needs might be greatest, although that's happening simultaneously. So to me, it just feels like there's a major reset happening. We're in the middle of it, so I don't know what the end state will look like, but a reset in play as far as what the employee value proposition should look like or will look like for these new entrants. So those are just some top of head thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I agree. We are kind of in the middle of it here. If any of the viewers have some thoughts about what they're dealing with in their own industries and want to type those into the chat, I'm sure Eileen and others would appreciate that as well. So let's go to our second round of questions here. And I'd like to ask each of you to highlight one to two future questions or issues companies would likely have to address relative to your topic, and or issues you expected to hear in your working group but did not. And so if we can take another 5 minutes each and reverse the order. So Becca, will have you start, then John can go next, then Brad, then JR. Go ahead, Becca.
Sure. So one of the issues that came up was employee perceptions and feelings about returning to the office versus continuing to work remotely and everything in between, all the options we know that exist in between. So one thing that did come up in my group was the fact that in some cases, employees might not always be thinking about the kind of the long-term implications of how and where they're working. So for example, one participant shared that younger generations, which we know are more likely to want to continue working remotely, may not necessarily be thinking about the longer term implications for developing mentoring and professional networks of just sort of working at home and not having those informal interactions in the office. One thing that didn't come up that I think is connected to that and that I think is important to consider is how to think about negotiating these different employee preferences, given that the implications aren't always straightforward and that these preferences were developed within a particular context of each type of work. So employees who have preferences about working in the office develop those preferences based on a prior time when everyone was working in the office. We know that having some reasonable number of people in the office may be important to a rewarding experience of actually being there in person. At the same time, people who express preferences to work remotely are doing so in a time when just about everyone else that they're working with is working remotely as well. Their interactions, their attendance at meetings is likely to be different and feel like a different experience when those meetings are taking place in a hybrid format. So thinking about negotiating not just how do we account for different individual preferences, but what do those look like when we put them all together and put all those different options that we give employees together, I think is an important issue that will definitely need attention moving forward. One other somewhat related point is that what did come up in my working group was the fact of these generational differences. So younger generations tend to, have these greater preferences and greater comfort working remotely. One question that I think is worth looking at in the long term is, to the extent that we accommodate workers' preferences and where and how they're working, is this likely to exacerbate generational divides that we already see in the workplace and organizations? And you can also imagine other demographic divides where we see differences in preferences, which we have addressed from in prior working groups and webinars from kind of a DEI perspective, but just in terms of any kinds of differences, sort of systematic differences in the types of employees or characteristics of employees that prefer working in one mode or another, what does that mean in terms of their future interactions and relationships within the organization?
Brad, let's go to you next.
Sure. So, I think there was a couple issues that kind of caught my attention as we kind of looked, a bit towards the horizon. One is, and we've touched on it a bit already, but is really kind of leadership development and what the future holds in that space in particular. We've seen some interesting trends over the last kind of year and a half as you look at various benchmarking studies out there that kind of really go against the long history of kind of trends in the learning and development space. So one is we saw a significant reduction in spending in the leadership development space. And, leading up to the present, L&D, leadership development is always one of those areas that got the bulk of, training funds, and was kind of front and center. And I think companies were investing heavily to build that next generation of leaders. So I think there's a question of, is this just the case of companies, maybe putting some programs on pause because they're not a good fit for virtual learning, and we're going to see those investments come back? Or is this kind of a more permanent maybe shift of training dollars into some areas and not others? I think similarly thinking about how will leadership development be delivered in the future. A number of participants in a working group talked about, executive appetite for learning virtually is probably higher now that they've been forced to do it and have experienced it. But again, as we talked about earlier, what do we lose by just doing, virtual learning for, leaders and new managers? We lose that social interaction. We lose the networking components that Becca was just talking about, which might have important implications. And perhaps, maybe most importantly to some of the comments earlier is really thinking about what do leaders need to be effective in the kind of new normal that's going to be the post-pandemic environment. There's some obvious things around kind of leading hybrid and remote teams. Those are kind of things that companies are already working on. But I think we'll see leaders increasingly being asked to really drive inclusion in their kind of work groups. They'll be asked to really kind of think about how the way they manage impact employee health and well-being. So I think these will be new issues that will require, some attention through leadership development. The second, kind of future issue, which really didn't come up in our working group, and I was a little bit surprised, but is really around the future of diversity training. We did a CAHRS study this past spring, focused on DE&I, and what we saw there is, companies are at different stages of kind of maturity in their DE&I strategy. And what we see is that as those strategies mature, companies' emphasis on diversity training, or at least what they're focusing on in that space, really evolves. So early on, it might be around just kind of awareness and unconscious bias training. But then as we see companies mature, we see them focusing on other topics: allyship, microaggressions, inclusive leadership. And so I think as we continue to push these DE&I agendas, really thinking about what should the focus of those training efforts be. Again, how should they be delivered? Because I think diversity training has been a place where we've always said it really should be in person, so we can have those really rich discussions and have that kind of high touch environment. So really thinking about not only what we're focusing on, but how that type of training is delivered in the future, I think will be some important questions for companies to tackle.
Yeah, good insights there. John, how about you?
Sure. So two thoughts on this. I think one, I was maybe a bit surprised at how much there's a short-term focus right now on managing attrition and its impact. I think it's maybe understandable just given the sharp increase we've seen, but a lot of short-term solutions around spot bonuses or pay raises, very comp focused. We know from the turnover literature that compensation is a pretty weak driver of retention. And so, I think as we look ahead into, the longer term, it seems like a longer term focus on how you manage attrition as an organization is becoming more critical or more important. It seems to be becoming more of a business issue, not just an HR issue. We've heard of several companies where, the turnover and vacancies are causing production delays, which is obviously causing revenue shortfalls and customer orders to be canceled. And so now that turnover is clearly impacting operations and business outcomes, I think it's coming more to the forefront for business leaders. And so, thinking more long-term about what is our approach to attrition as an organization? Are we going to build in buffers for the next time some economic crisis or other major event disrupts the organization? What does this look like from a HR practice standpoint to build systems that are geared towards attrition just as much as performance or anything else? And I think the last piece is that I think what we've seen here from the current environment is that turnover is now sort of a business risk, just like any other business risk, in the sense that your talent is leaving and causing disruptions that are very difficult to come back from. So I think that's one key bucket area. And I think the other is maybe selfishly as a researcher, do we know what's working and what's not working? This is like the best opportunity for experimentation in organizations. We have this major upheaval. Companies, I think, want to find solutions that are actually effective. And so wouldn't it be ideal if we could collect some data to understand in different locations, maybe what interventions to address turnover are more or less effective, and then be able to kind of scale those more broadly. I think right now there's a little bit of, kind of, again, short-term frantic reaction, understandably so. But if we had good data on this going forward, I think, it would benefit companies and, more broadly benefit our understanding of what's effective in curbing turnover. So those would be the kind of two key buckets, I would say.
Yeah. Hey, JR, how about some of the future focus areas you heard in your working groups?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we talked about, one of the most visible changes in the candidate experience was the shift to virtual interviews, right? Because you couldn't really invite, or many organizations stopped inviting people to campus, if you will, right, to have in-person interviews. And it led to a little discussion, and I wish we would have had more time for this on, I think, really, what is the future of the interview in the candidate experience? Lots of organizations have experimented with the use of virtual interviewing platforms where they put in questions and then candidates record the interviews. Some of the companies have had really good success with that. Some are much more skeptical about it. I think it raises this really interesting question of, what do we want the interview to do, right? In a lot of ways, the virtual sort of the platform interviewing does a lot of things that we know really help for evaluating candidates. You have a standard set of questions. Everybody answers the same questions. You can provide ratings, very soon after reviewing. You can review candidates all at once, right? Very similarly. But it eliminates the recruiting aspect of the interview, right? We think of hiring as a two-sided matching process. You're not showing individuals the culture, the location, their coworkers, what it would be like to work there. And so I think there's this question of how much emphasis on the interview part of the candidate experience / hiring process do we want to put on evaluating candidates versus sort of selling candidates there. And then, the other piece becomes who is involved in the interview process. In some ways, it's made it much more easy to have managers more involved in the interview process early on, because you can just stick somebody on a 30-minute Zoom call, and they don't have to worry about taking somebody out to lunch or actually physically moving from one location to another to be able to meet a candidate. But this raises the same questions, right? In terms of, are you getting that same personalized interaction? Are you getting a good sense of the candidate? Are you really evaluating them well? How much are you selling? And so I think there's this real open question on, do we want to go back to how it was? Do we want to keep it how we've done it virtually? Do we maybe want to in some cases, get rid of the interview altogether? And so I think, to John's point, it's this chance of thinking about, if we're bulk hiring maybe for a set of positions, do we want to try a couple different ways and then test the results and really see what could work, what might be the future for your particular organization and for particular roles?
Great. Yeah, there is some thinking companies need to do there for sure. Question came in here from Pedro that, JR, I'm going to ask you to take first, and then maybe Brad will have some insight too. But Pedro asked, have you seen a change on what career progression means, or career progression preferences in this new environment? For instance, with the increased preference to work remotely, is that bringing down the traditional idea of a vertical career path? And do we know what people are now looking for in their careers? What'd you hear, JR?
Yeah, this is a really great question. I wish I had a really great answer for this. I think this question has been bubbling up for a really long period of time as organizations have become delayered. There haven't been really clear career paths within organizations or even within industries. The individuals have been asking this question, and I think the pandemic really brought it up to the forefront, right? And part of it is, if jobs were eliminated, are they going to come back, right? Am I going to be able to continue to work from home, or am I going to have to work from home if I want to come in the office? I think it's forced workers to reconsider what they want out of their career. And I think we really have to think about careers in terms of employee preferences as opposed to exactly how we need to staff an organization going forward. And part of that's just really asking employees. And I think that's really what I heard in the candidate experience piece was, let's actually let's treat our employees as candidates, right? In part because we know that they're getting offers from all over the place. And so we need to continue to recruit them. And so let's try to find out what they actually want out of their careers. And can we redesign our internal recruiting processes and structures around what our employees want? So it's a long way of saying the best way to answer that question is to actually ask our employees themselves and try to redesign some systems around there. Maybe Brad, you have some different insights there.
I would agree with all that, JR. I just wanted to share, I did a research project with a company several years back that had a very large remote work population with about 40% of their employees worked entirely remote full time. And the project was really stimulated by the company experiencing a phenomenon where they would go to individuals that were high performers, offer them promotions, but those promotions, often to managerial roles, would require them to give up their remote work arrangement and come back into an office space to lead a team. And they were finding a large proportion of employees saying, no thanks, not right now. I'd rather keep my kind of remote work and my flexibility as opposed to getting this type of promotion. And as we kind of help them dig into it, what was interesting is you might think it was driven by some of the things we often think about as driving flexibility, such as caregiving responsibilities, childcare, elder care. And those certainly showed up, but for a lot of employees, it was just kind of those practical benefits, not having a long commute, saving money from not having a long commute, or even having to buy kind of work attire, et cetera. So I think it goes back to John's earlier point about this reset. And I think as employees really evaluate what they want from work and how that fits into their lives, I don't think we'll see, we won't see maybe the same notions of career progression and the kind of centrality of that maybe as what it was in the past.
Yeah, and Brad, I'll just jump back on this. Is one way to think about this, to look at this empirically, right? Using sort of analytics to this, is to look at which jobs are getting applications when they get posted in your organizations. And you can look at patterns of internal applications. Are employees looking for jobs? Are they applying more for lateral jobs? Are they applying more for jobs that have work from home options? Are they trying to apply for upward advancement within the same function or to a different business? And you can see sort of what's driving a sort of internal attraction within your organization. You could do the same with comparing that with where you're getting, what types of jobs are getting more or less external applications. And you can derive some insights there without having necessarily to have to spend as much time where it might be less practical surveying all your employees about their career aspirations. You can actually see in hard, sort of irrefutable data, which jobs do people want and where are they applying to those jobs from.
And the other thing I've heard in a recent working group I did on HR for HR is this, move away from vertical career paths to key experiences, right? And having people think about, what are the building blocks from the experiences they need to get over time to move through the organization versus that vertical career path. And that's a big shift, I think, many companies are trying to do, but are finding it, difficult to do in, in these flatter structures. So good. We have a few questions coming in here. Becca, I'm going to ask you to answer this one. Workload has become one of the major reasons for high turnover during this period. What have you heard as short-term or long-term possible solutions to this?
So this actually came up in my working group, both in the short term and the long term. So from a short term perspective, and this has come up in other working groups and webinars over the pandemic before, thinking about managing employees' time just in the course of a workday, things like scheduling meetings and leaving, scheduling meetings for 50 or 55 minutes instead of an hour, just to give employees some breathing room and feeling like they actually have time to just to live, to breathe, to use the bathroom, makes a difference in the day-to-day. A kind of bigger, longer term solution that a participant brought up in my group was really stepping back and reevaluating jobs and projects and teams, and just asking questions about all the taken for granted processes within organizations that add time and workload that might not necessarily be core to creating value, that might not necessarily be required to accomplish the work that we're trying to get done. This is a really, and this participant acknowledges, we had a great discussion around it. It's really kind of a fundamental rethinking of the way we design jobs, the way we think about assigning projects. And obviously it would require, if organizations were to implement this or to do this on a large scale, it would require a lot of work to accomplish this effectively. It's really revisiting every job, every role, every team. But the implications could be really significant if we think about streamlining our processes, which is going to increase efficiency, but also helping to curb employee burnout in the process.
I would just echo what Becca said. Work design, job design is becoming so critical right now. And I think it's something that we, maybe it gets a secondary look. We think of comp, development, staffing. We sort of think of the core HR practice areas, but job design, work design more broadly is so critical for the engagement piece, the satisfaction, attrition cycle. And so I would just echo exactly what Becca said, kind of rethinking that. And do we need to
I just think managers acknowledging that this is going on, right? And not everything can get done when they're trying to, do their own jobs and cover for others that have left, et cetera, it, can go a long way. Sometimes those simple things can go a long way too. Another question here, Brad, you might have some insights into this. We're seeing a rise in anger among employees as companies are promoting return to office and vaccine mandates, leading to distrust and fueling attrition. Any insights on how employers can mitigate that?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts. I think, we saw this in, JR's session around the candidate experience. I think John's session on turnover also raised this in terms of transparency and communication. I think we've seen companies back away from that, maybe because of the unpredictability. We don't want to put a message out there and have to reverse course kind of once it's floated. But I think employees are kind of sitting back really in this kind of vacuum of information, which I think is driving some of that distrust, ambiguity, and in some cases, anger as well. I saw a recent survey of employees that asked, to what extent has their company communicated what the future of work is going to look like in their organization? For a vast majority of them, their company hadn't communicated anything, right? So employees, I think, are looking for information. They want to reduce some of that ambiguity in a very kind of disruptive time. So I think, putting out there what you can, recognizing that it might be subject to change, but I think communicating as openly and transparently as possible. I think there's some other issues here. Colleague Susan Bogart and I did a session through CAHRS a couple of weeks ago on cultural fault lines, because I think we've seen a lot of divisions in our country, right, around politics, around race, and other social justice issues, around now vaccine, not vaccinated issues. And so, these are all kind of coming to the forefront as employees start coming back in the office, and are perhaps amplified because people have been kind of isolated and they've been kind of living in their own worlds, consuming the information that they're comfortable with through the channels that, maybe make sense to them, et cetera. So, what we have heard from companies is, really trying to have discussions around these things, kind of meeting employees where they are and having kind of open discussions, trying to kind of, bringing back in mediation and other skills that maybe are somewhat of a lost art. But I think, companies will have to continue to wrestle with some of these fault lines / employee activism, whatever you want to call it, here over the near and long term.
Yeah, I think that's a big one, interesting one to do some research in. One that came in through the chat from a viewer was, have you seen or heard about higher attrition in HR versus the rest of the roles in the organization? Is HR burnout becoming an issue? And we just did a working group, that was one of the big issues that was talked about. And so, because HR has been dealing with all of these issues with the pandemic for longer than anyone, trying to figure out how do we work remotely? Where are our employees all over the world? How are we going to communicate? What technology are we going to use? Everything. It definitely is a spot where the companies that participated in that recent working group said HR was seeing higher attrition. And so there weren't easy answers. They did talk a lot about HR burnout and, how do you deal with that within the function as well as within the rest of the company. And again, there weren't easy answers to that. People are looking for third parties to really come in and help them with expertise around that area. I think, HR wants to be the solution to all these kinds of things. And in certain pockets of HR definitely has expertise in burnout. But I think they get even more frustrated when they feel like they don't have that to help the organization. So there's some upskilling going on there with third-party organizations coming in. One company was talking about having kind of a first responders type of training to help HR and help deal with issues of burnout throughout the organization. So there's some working group notes on our website that I'd encourage you to take a look at. So thanks for that question. Another one that's come in here through the Q&A that I'm going to ask Becca to take, and then JR, is have we seen shifts in traditional talent review processes such as succession planning or hypo identification and development in the post-pandemic world? What do you think, Becca?
So one consideration sort of directly related to that is that came up in my group was the sort of stepping back and adding a greater emphasis on the sort of the how employees get their work done versus the what's your level of performance or productivity, recognizing that it takes something different to be effective in the remote or hybrid work environment, but also the way that we interact with our colleagues and as leaders with our employees may matter even more when people are not physically together and connected in the office. So that's one consideration that came up. That's just in terms of the talent review and identifying talent. One other piece that's maybe a little tangentially related to this, but I think is worth noting. A couple of participants noted really encouraging managers to have more frequent conversations, informal conversations with employees about how they're doing, areas for improvement, but also importantly, recognizing that even small efforts, small accomplishments to maintain that connection, but also to sort of to guide and reinforce the behavior that we want to see in organizations versus waiting for those, quarterly or annual meetings that are more formal and that kind of create more pressure around these conversations, making it less formal and more ongoing so that they can be more natural and employees have more of an opportunity to respond. So that's a little bit more on the engagement side, but also the development side than the talent identification. But those are a couple of insights there.
Yeah, and Becca, something really related to that came up in our working group, and I've heard in other conversations with our partner companies, this idea that part of those regular conversations managers should have with employees is this question about what do you want to do next, right? So organizations have tended to think about succession plans as being driven from the top down, right? Some sort of talent review committee looks at individuals who are high potential or who are tagged for future leadership roles, put them on a spreadsheet, and then maybe revisit that once a year. But what has been happening more and more is they then turn to those employees when those roles come up, and they realize they don't want them, right? Maybe that involves coming back into the office where they didn't have to do it, or they've just changed their priorities, changed their interests. And so on the succession planning piece, it's actually involving the employees who are on that succession plan more often and more regularly and understanding what they want. The other piece here is organizations, and a few mentioned this in the working group, thinking about external succession planning, right? So thinking about whether that's engaging a third-party search firm, not simply when you have an opening, but to do some talent mapping for you, or whether to create some proactive filters on LinkedIn where you're keeping track of people who may potential external candidates for certain jobs, so that you not only have an internal pool of folks that you're keeping an eye on and sort of grooming and thinking about the role, but also thinking about who can I proactively reach out to when that role becomes open or when we know it's going to become open. So it's not a mad scramble, right? When a job becomes open.
A question that just came in through the Q&A was, will the recording be shared? And it definitely will. So you'll get a link to this automatically once it's been posted tomorrow. So you can be on the lookout for that. If they have any last questions, please send them in. I'm going to ask our panelists a couple as we wait for those. John, everybody's talking about the Great Resignation or whatever we want to coin this term here. how long do we think this is going to last? What can we expect in the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, I think we're already starting to see some plateauing in the turnover rates by industry. So it does signal to me that maybe the matching process is working itself through the system, and people are potentially finding new opportunities. And I think there were lower switching costs during the pandemic as you move from remote company to remote job. And I don't know that employees are going to continue to do that in the next 12 to 18 months again and again. So, I could be wrong, but it does feel like maybe we're seeing a bit of a plateau here, and things will, stabilize a bit in the next year would be my guess. And the early data suggests that it is.
That's a relief. But there are some organizations, JR, out there still looking for people for sure. And so if you think about, the hybrid way to interview, et cetera, is it realistic to provide every unsuccessful candidate feedback? And who should be the ones communicating with those candidates?
Yeah, this is certainly something that was a hot topic in my session, right? So candidates want transparency and feedback. Big part of the candidate experience is experiencing rejection, right? 99.9% of candidates don't get the job. We'd like them maybe to reapply in the future. We don't want to disengage them from the organization. This is a really tough one to answer. I think the organizations that are doing this the best and finding the most success are ones where, certainly for individuals who are so big piece is what's realistic. It's not realistic to provide everybody with feedback. What's important is thinking about who were those candidates who rose to the top but maybe just didn't get hired. So thinking about really who's that curated set of maybe finalists for a role that you want to keep engaged. And the number one thing is that the person who needs to contact those individuals is the hiring manager. Hiring managers don't want to do it because it takes time and it can be uncomfortable to say you didn't get a job, but just receiving, that personalized touch from the hiring manager, preferably with a phone call versus an email, really seems to make a difference in perceptions of individuals reporting back on the positivity or negativity of their candidate experience. I think every organization has to work really carefully with HR about the amount of feedback that they're willing and able to share. There's often fear that if you provide any potential constructive criticism, that you're going to get sued. That's often overblown. But what managers do want to know what they can and cannot say. So giving managers the playbook, if you're going to ask managers to respond to candidates and call them and say they didn't get the job, you want to give them a sense of what they're able to talk about and what they're not, so that they're not sort of jumping into the dark.
A couple more questions have come in here. One in the chat that, people are reading, the next concern from companies is the gap that's going to be created after the last of the baby boomers retire and leave that gap that the hiring pool can't fill. What thoughts do we have there?
I can jump in with one very simple practical tool, which is around retaining some of those workers after they retire to help come back on a more short-term basis for developing and maybe mentoring employees. Kind of an obvious one, but I just wanted to break the silence.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It came up in our session is attracting older workers, right? We tend to sort of, there is some age cutoff where recruiters or organizations tend to think that we shouldn't be targeting. We always need to be targeting the young up and comers. But there's this huge untapped potential of individuals who want what we call sort of second experiences, right, in the workplace, and thinking about how to actively reach out to those individuals. You have it's an untapped pool, one that's often underutilized by organizations.
I wonder too how this will be shaped by advances in technology. It's funny because now we're talking all of a sudden about gaps in filling jobs, right? And just a couple of years ago, we were talking about how many jobs would be displaced by advances in technology, automation, robotics, and all these things, right? And I wonder if some of this will kind of equal out in the sense that, if we anticipate, future gaps, in talent and hiring pools, do we ramp up investments in technology to be able to close some of that. And then certainly we've seen during the pandemic increased investments in the technology space. And I think we're likely to continue to see that.
I think that's right. Okay, we have one more question in the Q&A, which I'm going to ask. I'll start, but I'll ask each of you if you have any comment you want to make. What is one habit or capability that HR professionals need to unlearn? We're so focused on what we need to do. Curious if you have thoughts on what HR professionals need to stop doing. I think the one thing I've seen is, separate from the pandemic, but more as we've seen the HR operating model transition, it's really hard for HR folks to stop doing what they used to do for people. So even as HR shared services organizations have evolved, if you have relationships with different people in your groups, they may be coming to you for something that's not part of your job anymore. And rather than turn them away or not meet their need, you're still doing that. And I think the thing that HR folks need to do in order to make these new models work, especially in a hybrid situation, is to be able to say no and to redirect them and help them get the help that they need from the right resource. And that's just going to make the whole model work better. Anybody else with a thought there?
I think one thing we've heard in some of the work we've done is, I think one of the habits that HR has actually broken during the pandemic has been this notion of everything needs to be entirely 100% buttoned up perfect before we roll something out. And I think we've heard that HR has been forced to be much more agile, to move quickly, to put out solutions that are maybe 80% good enough, not perfect. And I think that's actually a good development for the function. I think we've seen transformation, we've seen developments that probably in normal times would have taken years, if not decades, transpire in the last 18 months. So hopefully that's kind of broken one habit and maybe has created a positive development, for the field.
Go ahead, Becca.
No, I was just going to jump in and add to what Brad said. So just in a conversation, the other day I had a discussion about organizations involving employees and people managers in some of those processes, in working out the kinks and figuring out how are these practices and processes actually going to look? Are they a good fit? And what are some of the problems we can anticipate with them? So making it more of a working process versus, like Brad said, kind of all buttoned up, here's the solution.
From the turnover standpoint, in some of the conversations I've had, it is either explicitly said or it just seems that some companies are pinning attrition and turnover problems on HR as if it's HR's issue to deal with or to manage. And clearly it's not. It's the organization's problem. It's hiring manager's problem. It's the labor market's problem. It's a host of factors that HR maybe can, provide insights on and advise on. But certainly HR itself shouldn't feel the burden to solve turnover problems.
Good insights. Yeah, thanks, gang, for that. I want to thank all of our panelists and to those of you that participated in the working groups as well, and hope to see you at a future CAHRS event.